Alright, hi everybody. We are hitting the home stretch, just a couple more chapters. Let's see here. Today I'm giving you a combined lecture on chapters 8 and 9. I think they both go together really well. To focus on what earlier we learned about as intersectionality, which is how different types of identities, statuses, demographic characteristics can combine to form different types of life experience. And so today it's going to be the intersection of gender, sex, and sexuality on the one hand, chapter 8, and then race and ethnicity on the other, chapter 9, and of course those two things go together. Everyone has a sex, everyone has a gender, even if they're not fully aware of it. We have a race, we have an ethnicity. If we're white, we maybe don't think of those things quite as often or as explicitly, but obviously if you're non-white, especially given all the different social and political events 2019, race and ethnicity come up a lot. And so, for example, you could be Hispanic and female, and those combined equate to a very different type of social experience compared to someone who's Caucasian and male. And then you throw in whether you're maybe able-bodied or not, whether you're from a rural or urban area or not, whether you're heterosexual or not, and you end up with some very different types of life experience. So before we start, I'm going to put this in an email, but I leave in a couple of days for a big conference in New York City, so I might be a little bit incommunicado, but I'll get your second writing assignment done or graded right on when I get back, and your last chapter, the family chapter, I'll put everything up for you, but everything up on UB Learns, but the video lecture probably won't happen until the 12th. And that's really all we got until the exam, the second exam, which is just like the first exam on the 16th. So those are kind of your major due dates, what's going on administratively. All right. Okay, so start with chapter 8. Some sections we'll cover, some sections I won't. I'm just going to kind of focus on what's most relevant, I think, given what we've learned in the first few chapters. So we're going to start out defining sex from gender. And so sex is your biological sex, whether you have male or female reproductive organs. This is not a biology class, but that's how we define sex. Gender is what we do, how we behave, how we appear. Think of it as our appearance. And so we associate, say, facial hair with men and masculinity. We don't associate facial hair with females and femininity. In fact, we kind of have these norms in our culture that coerce women into making sure they don't have any facial hair. It's considered kind of a violation of a social norm, even though every once in a while a hair might poke out here and there from somewhere, but that's seen as abnormal even though it's a natural process. So we have these social ideas and kind of very arbitrary social ideas about how we're supposed to look, even though we have all this variation in how people appear juxtaposed to what they are biologically. So for example, if I wore a lot of makeup and wore a dress, shave my beard, we would consider me then as having feminine a feminine identity, feminine appearance, feminine gender. We might call this a queer gender identity when we kind of perform the gender characteristics of the sex opposite than what we are. Sometimes this is also referred to in a slightly different way as transgender. Transgender is when someone identifies more with a different type of gender appearance than what they are biologically, even going so far as that they may feel they have what's called gender dysphoria, feeling that they were born into essentially the wrong body. And so at the kind of, you call it the extreme, these people even go to lengths to have their reproductive sex organs altered to be that of the sex that corresponds to their gender identity. So this is what you would call sex change surgery. So many people who undergo sex change surgery probably already identify and appear as transgender, meaning so these would be, say, biological men who identify and appear as women or with feminine characteristics, and they undergo the surgical procedures necessary to transition from male to female and from transgender then to transsexual. So in some ways, if your gender doesn't correspond to your sex, we may call that dressing in drag, or passing as the other sex. And so the sections in this chapter on kind of media portrayals of women, gender socialization, thinking back to our gender socialization chapter, or the chapter on socialization in which we talked about gender, a lot of things we attribute to masculinity and femininity are not expressions of naturalness, but really socially produced ideas about how people should be, but a lot of people don't feel comfortable in those boxes. Lastly, there's intersex. So intersex people, our textbook mentions this is about 1 in 1,500 people are born with ambiguous sex organs. Many times these are surgically altered to correspond to one sex or the other. And so that's obviously rare, but it happens. The textbook mentions it. Well, obviously the overwhelming majority of people are born male or female sexually, but how that then corresponds to gender is more complicated. So to kind of focus on gender, gender is what we are taught, and that we usually create and recreate through interactions with others. And so think about, like, why do women wear dresses? Are they necessary? Not really. Women can wear pants just like men. Plenty of women do. Why don't men wear dresses? There isn't necessarily anything unique to a dress, necessarily. That would mean that men can't wear them. You know, obviously Scottish people who wear kilts would tell you that, you know, a kilt maybe isn't a dress or a skirt, but it definitely resembles one. And so gender is what we are taught, and also how we are shaped. When we think about, say, like the marketing industry around women's makeup and women's fashion, is definitely a big part of gender socialization. Beard trimming products, manscaping products for men are another example. You know, if you're a man now in 2019, it's fashionable to have hair, long hair, a beard, but it better be sculpted, better be shaped, better be trimmed. It's considered unprofessional and also not necessarily as attractive, conventionally attractive to have like a big old mountain man beard. Um, don't have back hair, don't have straight neck hair, don't have hair coming out of your ears. So even though we think of men as having lots of privileges and not being as physically coerced as women, which is true, there are still limitations to the extent to which men can um, look ragged and rugged. So a lot of ways men can look rugged and manly, but it has to be also in this kind of refined way that takes some time and some effort. Obviously, for women, when we think of like the cosmetics industry, the cosmetics industry really tells young women that how you look with a full face of makeup on is how you're always supposed to look, when we know that's not really how you look naturally. It's not how you look when you wake up in the morning. And so when we're thinking about gender and sex, kind of quickly, our three main perspectives. So the functionalist perspective, when we're thinking about the order, especially pre-modernity, I think like pre-1960s really shapes men and women, tells men and women they have a particular gender role. And so that's breadwinning for men, being strong, aggressive leaders, maybe being a warrior in a primitive tribal culture. For women, this would be being maternal, a mother, staying at home, taking care of the children, being a domestic caretaker. So very distinct spheres we put people in. The conflict perspective tells us about how not everyone feels like they fit into these roles. Maybe some men want to stay at home, and maybe some women want to rule the world and be corporate CEOs. Maybe we have women who want to be president. Maybe we have men who just want to hang out at the playground with their kids all day and think that sounds fun. So conflict is really what happens when these socially defined and socially prescribed roles come into conflict with each other. And that's really, in a lot of ways, how we define a lot of gender conflicts in the last almost half century, kind of dating back to 1960. Conflicts over what are proper male and female roles and how they're evolving and changing really defines a lot of our gender politics. Then the symbolic interactionist perspective is how we attach different meanings to interactions and behaviors. So I think previous chapters talked about, one person's wink at the bar is flattering to someone, but maybe offensive to someone else. What can be seen as aggressive behavior to one person can seem charming to someone else. In terms of, oh, this man is chasing me. Another person would say, that guy's a stalker. How we interpret what is aggressive compared to what is assertive. How we interpret what is a healthy expression of emotion compared to an unhealthy expression of melodrama and histrionics. For example, the extent to which men can be seen as vulnerable and how that may make them sissies, particularly I think when you're children on the playground. And as well as women in the workplace, they're more likely than men to be seen as being bitchy if they're assertive than men. So there are consequences for violating gender norms, but people interpret gender norms differently compared to their geographic background, compared to how they were raised, their political affiliation, type of workplace they're in. Academia is very liberal, has a very liberal culture. Maybe a corporate law firm has a very conservative culture when women are expected, even if they're equal lawyers in the firm, to wear pencil skirts and look very feminine and sexual and almost perform the roles of glorified secretaries. So with interactions, we really want to think about the variation across and different interpretations of interaction. And in many ways, we go through ways of what on page 154 is called undoing gender. When we have these aspects that we find uncomfortable, we try to navigate them, bend them, put ourselves around people who accept us for who we are. So, in your romantic relationships, maybe if you're a woman, you seek out a man who's really supportive of you having your own career and maybe even becoming more educated and making more money than your male partner, or finding a male partner who's okay with that. If you're a man, maybe you seek out a female partner who doesn't mind and even appreciates that you cry once in a while. So this is what we call kind of gender as social structure. All these kind of traditional ways, all of which you've probably experienced in your life, that we are shaped and coerced, but that we often find ourselves boxed into and try to work around in some way. And so gender as social structure entails how we're socialized, social interactions, organizational structures. Think like school systems. School systems oftentimes are still female dominated in terms of who is most likely to be an elementary school teacher. That can maybe play out different ways, take on the playground. To what extent are young girls encouraged to be rambunctious, maybe on the playground compared to small boys? And gender socialization starts at birth. For example, think about the way toys are socialized, essentially blue or pink, masculine and feminine. Men are building, right? They have like fire trucks, construction trucks that obviously they would use outside the home. Think of how many female toys revolve around cooking or child rearing. My sister has a 4-year-old, 2.5-year-old, and a 6-month-old, and all the toys that her kids have are so still conventionally gendered that it's really kind of scary for 2019. And so when we move away from something like toys to something, say, like the media, think about, traditional Disney movies. They kind of, and even like modern day romantic comedies, kind of coerce us into thinking that, men have to be somebody, women are supposed to find somebody, is it a marital mate, and then life is really complete once you get married. Obviously, some modern Disney movies are more modern, in that, they show women in positions of power and authority and not looking for a man to define themselves. But these classic ones like Cinderella or Snow White, Beauty and the Beast, obviously have dominant roles in American culture. And so this all tails into our gender scripts, these expectations that we are assigned based on our gender. So imagine if you're a young boy, say 5 years old, and you really just want to play with baby dolls. Even if you have parents who are modern enough and support that and don't mind, think of what's going to happen when you're at a neighbor's for a play date, how teachers may react, how that child's classmates might react, relatives. So even if you're the most kind of modern, egalitarian-minded family possible, it's hard to escape all of the various other social pressures that we encounter in different institutions, like through the media, education, maybe church. And so kind of moving on, so now I'm on page 158, 159, thinking about the media. Think about how the media reproduces and challenges stereotypes about gender, particularly in terms of female sexuality and female attractiveness. So we have these pictures of Beyonce on page 159. And so if you look at doing sociology on 8.3, or activity 8.3 on page 159, the exercise asks us to think about how media shapes our gender expectations. How do music, news, and advertisements tell us how women are supposed to appear? How does something like Keeping Up with the Kardashians teach us women are supposed to appear? How is female sexuality compared to male sexuality portrayed in media, movies, TV? See, there are things to really pay attention to as you're reading across pages 158 through 161, which is really about the variation in gender representations, particularly in terms of sexuality in the media. And the other part of this chapter that I want to focus on is on gender segregation in the workforce. And so you really want to pay attention to a lot of the graphs and charts across pages 162 to really 166. So I'm going to kind of pose these in the series of questions for you to think about as you're going over this chapter and looking over all the additional materials that are on UB Learns. Why do we have a gender-segregated occupational workforce? Why do women become nurses more, and why do men become doctors more? Why are women still secretaries more, and why are men lawyers more? Look at our labor force by participation by gender on page 163. Why are men just in the occupational workforce more? I'll give you one hint to preview our last chapter that will make some sense. Some of the variations in female outcomes, particularly why women make less money and they work less than men, can partially be attributed, well, I thought I had it. I think it's page 191. No. All right, hold that thought. I'm going to find it. Found it. On page 219 in the family chapter, I wish this were in the gender chapter. There's a chart, this is page 219, comparing paid and unpaid leave in 21 countries. America is one of the few industrial developed countries in the world with no federally mandated paid maternity leave. So look at page 219 to be shocked and awed. But that provides the context for why many of women's work outcomes are unfortunately not as good as men's, because having kids is hard, and basically it's hard, especially for a dual income household. So this contributes to things called what we call the gender wage gap and the glass ceiling, why women make around 75 cents on the dollar, why women are underrepresented at the highest reaches of institutional, governmental, and political structures. Like, why do we have only a small, tiny number of female CEOs? Why haven't we had a female president? Why aren't there many female senators? So this kind of discrimination, these obstacles contribute to the wage gap. Although, interesting, if you look at page 164, things are changing. Women are starting to out-earn men in terms of college degrees. So women are going to college more, staying in college more. Men can still find decent industrial and manufacturing work without a college degree. But obviously that creates some cultural obstacles and kind of cultural variables, if women are becoming more educated than men, particularly in terms of marriage outcomes. There's some similarity when we look at doctoral and professional degrees on page 165. Page 168, there's a figure of women CEOs in Fortune 500 companies, 95 to 07. And you can see a good uptick from 95 to 2017, or what looks like a good uptick until you actually look at how many there are across your vertical column. So these types of things, gender occupational segregation, women kind of being funneled based on the assumption of traits like being more nurturing, ending up in positions like nursing compared to being doctors. We want to think about as we are looking at the second half of this chapter and the other material I put on UB Learns. Why are women's outcomes not as good as men's? Why aren't men more supported politically, legally, culturally into being better, more involved parents? So to segue into our race and ethnicity chapter, if you look at page 166, figure 8.7, median weekly earnings by gender and race and ethnicity, you can look at how earnings differ between men and women per ethnic group. Totally, the comparison for whites, comparison for African Americans, comparison for Asians, as well as Hispanics and Latinos. Men are always out earning women. Why is that the case? After reading this chapter, why do you think that would be the case? Answering these zillion rhetorical questions I'm throwing at you will be helpful for answering the discussion board post, which I think is a trickier question compared to previous ones I've given you. All right. So that has a segue into our race and ethnicity chapter. I'm going to take a little break. I'll be right back. All right, and I'm back. So now we're in chapter 9, and we're thinking about, in contrast to the social construction of gender, the social construction of race and ethnicity. So ethnicity, or an ethnic group, would be those who share the same cultural heritage. So now we're thinking about culture again. So this would be like language, nation, and religion. So in the American context, Jamaican Americans, Cuban Americans, Haitian Americans, Italian Americans, Irish Americans, etc., etc. This would be in contrast to race, where we make these kind of arbitrary distinctions based on how we appear. And so we always assume that kind of racial background matches genetic background, but that's not the case. For example, someone with a white parent and a black parent can present as much more white than black, or vice versa. Barack Obama was that way. Remember, Barack Obama had a white parent, but kind of looking at him, we might think he had two African American parents. So we call him our first African American president, which he was, but he was also of mixed ethnicity. And so, for example, like the census in America has these kind of arbitrary distinctions, like Black, American Indian, Alaskan Native, Asian or Pacific Islander, or white. Sometimes you don't know what box to check. You might check more than one. Just because you appear white, you may actually be Hispanic, depending on a whole host of factors. Particularly now in 2019, people's family trees can be so mixed that it can be hard to kind of make these distinctions. So, for example, Hispanic Americans may comprise an umbrella ethnic group and can be of any race and tend to be treated as a distinct racial group, but they could be Panamanian, Honduran, Haitian, Mexican, El Salvadoran, both. Someone could have an Honduran parent and a Mexican parent. It doesn't make them Panamanian, but we kind of arbitrarily in America use Hispanic or Latino to describe everyone from a Hispanic background or Latino country when there are so many, each with their own distinct culture. Just watch the World Cup. Hondurans aren't rooting for Panama. So, with this in mind, kind of Americans often get confused by terms, race, ethnicity, country of origin. You know, you might be born in America, but maybe moved to England when you were 3 because one of your parents got a really good job. Maybe you naturalized as a British citizen, you know, so you're kind of legally British. Maybe you've been kind of acculturated into a British lifestyle. But then we're thinking about kind of country where you're socialized. That doesn't make you ethnically or racially British. It maybe makes you kind of culturally and legally, but not racially and ethnically. So we tend to kind of confuse these things a lot. In America, first-generation Americans are often not culturally treated as real Americans or as American as people whose families have been here for a long time, when really, legally, they're as much of a citizen as anybody else. They can vote the same way as anybody else, but they're treated kind of as somehow secondary. What else? So you'd want to kind of look over the parts on prejudice, discrimination, and stereotypes. You know, similar to the gender chapter, there's some parts in here I'll suggest you kind of go over yourself, try to teach yourself. But the biggest thing, kind of in terms of American history, is think about institutional discrimination. There's been a whole host and series of laws in America to kind of make sure white people in their kind of social, economic, and political power is not encroached on too much by people not like them. So if you look at pages 184 to 186, Hailstone Compromise of 1877, Chinese Exclusion Acts of 82 and 92, Gentlemen's Agreement of 1907, Immigration Act of 1924, Immigration Act of 1965. We have this whole really kind of rough history in America of trying to maintain American identity as a white identity. And so, for example, when we think about racial and ethnic inequality today, if you look at page 187 on housing, so housing is kind of a major institution in a lot of ways. We all need shelter. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 was made to remedy some of the forms of racial discrimination from the past. So that was a good thing. But racial discrimination in housing, the persistence of segregation still exists. For example, I'll read you a section from page 187. Today, while not explicitly refusing to give loans to racial minorities, many banks simply do not offer services in areas with higher percentages of minorities, resulting in relatively few home loans for people of color. Banks have also driven Black and Latino applicants to mortgages with higher rates. For example, in 2017, the city of Philadelphia sued Wells Fargo, accusing it of discriminating against Black and Hispanic people seeking home mortgages. The suit says that African Americans were twice as likely and Hispanics 1.7 times as likely as equally qualified whites to be offered only high-cost mortgage loans. This is part of a pattern. In 2012, Wells Fargo paid $175 million to settle a lawsuit brought by the Department of Justice that claimed the bank offered loans to blacks and Latinos at higher interest rates than the loans they gave to white applicants with similar qualifications. So, if black and Latino home buyers able to secure loans at all, they tend to have to pay more for them than similar white applicants. We should find that disturbing. To give you some context, Buffalo's East Side, for those of you who are Western New Yorkers, highly segregated area. Buffalo's in the top 10 for cities with a high segregation index, for cities with populations over a 250,000. So if you could drive through Buffalo on the west side, particularly the east side, you'll see these things kind of in real life, in real time. So I'm going to write gender chapter, look at unemployment rates on figure 9.4, page 189, figure 9.5, education completion rates, and look at the completion rates for racial and ethnic groups compared to white groups. Let me look at college completion. Why, throughout this chapter, what have you learned that may explain what is happening in these two graphs? Another thing, when you look at unequal outcomes in the criminal justice system, look up anything, particularly on YouTube, on mass incarceration, you're going to find some disturbing facts. So I'd really focus on this part of the criminal justice system. When you look at male population in state and federal prison by race and ethnicity, in 2014, figure 9.7, page 191, look at the percentages for Hispanics and blacks relative to the white population in terms of what their prison population is. So back in chapter 1, we learned kind of the individualistic explanation for this, which would be the conventional explanation. How sociologically, what have we learned in this course that would explain these really scary statistics in figure 9.7? Looking at government, page 192, why do we have really such kind of poor racial representation on corporate boards, government positions, etc.? So I'm not going to spend too much extra time with any more of this. I think, this chapter allows you some opportunities to kind of teach some of this yourself, especially using your interactive textbook. But the thing I want to end on is a section on racism and ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism refers to the belief that one's own culture is superior to others. I would disagree with our textbook in the fact that it also has to do with what we see as our sense of normal. So in the American context, we often feel that being American is being white, that our kind of picaresque view of Americanness is whiteness. Think about how we think about Uncle Sam looking, or Santa Claus, or think about everyone who's on Mount Rushmore. When white people only really make up about 2/3 of the population, that number's going down as people continue to have mixed marriages ethnically. So we have this sense of normal in America being white, which even if demographically and numerically that makes it normal, it's not normal for a really large chunk of the population, and that's a third of the population. So if you're particularly if you're African American or Hispanic American, whiteness is not your normal, but you're just as a legitimate American citizen as anybody else. And so, how we're socialized in culture has been this kind of recurring theme in the course so far. And so when we teach race and ethnicity, we often teach about what we consider to be kind of minority or excluded voices, which in the American context, that's largely African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans. But we also need to critique whiteness, or think about whiteness critically. And that's that, white in America is something normal for everybody. And that's what we call ethnocentrism. In Buffalo, on my street in North Buffalo, I live around people who are Hispanic, people who are Black, other ethnic minorities. Sometimes at my gym, white people are the numerical minority. That's a feeling that white people are not very used to, and in certain cases when they encounter it, it makes them feel uncomfortable, because then they are not the normal. And so that's kind of the last thing I want to end with for this chapter. I believe your discussion board for this chapter is due the 10th. So good luck with that. And I'll talk to you guys soon.